It's always with the best intentions that the worst work is done. Oscar Wilde is credited with that quote more than 150 years ago, but it certainly applies today, especially when it comes to small businesses and a federal law that strapped them with more red tape than a badly wrapped birthday present. That was until last week. It seems sometimes strongly worded letters, well, they do kind of have an impact. Joe Paris looked into how a law meant to prevent money laundering and funding of terrorism had Idaho small business owners buried in paperwork.
In government and politics, if something isn't working, the people will probably tell you. The federal Corporate Transparency Act is at the top of that list.
Our office has received thousands, and I truly mean thousands, of angry phone calls.
Secretary of State Phil McGrain is responsible for running crucial business services. But one of those was essentially dropped on his desk by the federal powers that be.
They said, Secretaries of State, you have to be the messenger. You need to tell all these business owners that they have this new requirement and that there are these penalties.
Long story short, the Corporate Transparency Act aimed to stop major business and financial crimes. Within it, a provision required businesses to submit personal and business information that would go into a federal database.
It's specifically trying to target drug dealers, money launderers, terrorists, to make sure people aren't hiding money. The only challenge is what they've done is they said basically all small business owners, we assume that you're guilty of these things until you prove otherwise.
And bizarrely enough, major corporations had an exemption. The pile of paperwork small businesses were still forced to deal with cost time and money, significant amounts.
I'm a business owner in Coeur d'Alene, and so we were actually dealing with that.
Representative Jordan Redmond sponsored a legislative letter to Congress asking them to repeal the act that originated in 2019. The act ended up being buried in a complicated spending bill for the military that had an effective date of January 1st, 2024.
As a small business owner, it was terrible to go through.
Motivations behind the original concept might have been sincere, but the impact in reality quickly set in.
This is the definition of government overreach. When you're, penalizing the good actors for the few bad actors, that's something that has no place in our state.
Secretary McGrain agreed, signing off on a letter to President Trump asking for intervention. And later, McGrain and Idaho led the way in the conversation, filing a unique argument challenging the legality of it all.
It's really saying, hey, you don't have the legal authority to cause state secretaries of state to try and enforce your laws for you. If you want to have bad laws, go ahead and enforce them yourselves, but the state of Idaho doesn't have an obligation to do it. I'm hopeful that that really carries the day. We'll see what happens.
While there are concerns about the legality of the act, major violations of privacy, McGrain watched the threat of consequence, prison time and major fines strike fear into small businesses across the state.
We all want to stop terrorism. We all want to stop drug dealers and anybody committing financial crimes, but there's more targeted ways we can do that where we actually go after the criminals and not all the good people who are just trying to help our economy thrive.
President Trump and his administration listened to Idaho voices, pausing enforcement on reporting requirements just last week.
Whichever side of the aisle you're on, I think everyone can agree that we don't need more forceful government.
It's been really frustrating for the secretaries of state because it feels like we're getting a black eye for this overreach and this just heavy hand of government when the state of Idaho had no part in this. It's hard enough to get a business going. We don't need to make it harder. Part of why Idaho's economy is thriving is because we aren't regulated like what we're seeing come out of Washington, D.C.
So the Corporate Transparency Act, if you've never heard of it before, that's okay. If you have heard of it, I'm sure that you are glued to your TV right now for what I'm about to say next. There still needs to be action on the congressional level to get rid of it. What has essentially happened right now is the federal government says we're not going to enforce this. However, technically, Brian, it is still on the books, and Congress has essentially signed off on a one-year pause on the entire thing. However, Secretary McGrain tells me that whether it's a court that stops it, whether the government, Congress, they repeal the act themselves, or maybe even the president does executive action, he would be very happy to see this go away, something that, as you heard, was a real problem for small businesses.
As we all know, too, Congress works very quickly these days, so we'll see how that plays out. But it is interesting when it comes to federal laws. Secretary McGrain saying, yeah, you should enforce it because it's a federal law. Wouldn't that apply to immigration as well? Would think. We'll answer that another day. Thanks, Joe.